It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this talk by Associate Professor Johanna Weaver from the Australian National University. The talk serves two functions. It's the keynote of a workshop that is being organised by the International Peace and Security Interest Group of the Australian and New Zealand Society of International Law and the Law and the Future of War Research Group at the University of Queensland. But the talk is also the second installment in the Law Matters series that has been recently launched by UQ Law School. And this is a string of lectures and seminars intended to address legal issues of national and international significance, and the series is open to all. So today's talk will focus on the discussion at the United Nations around the applicability of international law to cyber operations, including the important intergovernmental understanding reached in May 2021 that international humanitarian law does in fact apply to cyber operations during armed conflict. There is no better person to discuss this with us than Johanna, because she was directly involved in forging that important understanding. Johanna is currently the director of the Tech Policy Design Center at ANU, and the center's purpose is to reimagine how to use governance as a tool to shape technology to maximize its positive impacts. Before joining the ANU, Johanna was a diplomat. She's served as Australia's independent expert and lead cyber negotiator at the UN, and prior to that led the cyber affairs branch at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So thank you very much, Johanna, for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here, Ryan. And thank you to everyone for coming along to hear the presentation today. I have to make a confession at the start, which is we've just launched a major report of the Tech Policy Design Centre yesterday. So whilst I have put a lot of thought into this presentation, it is not a pre-prepared speech. So you're going to get me ad-libbing, which could be good for you and dangerous for me, but we'll see how it goes. So what I wanted to talk to you today about was about the agreement that we reached at the UN in May last year, but specifically looking at that in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because I think it's really important to contextualize this. The first point that I wanted to really highlight is a lot of the commentary in Ukraine or around what has happened in Ukraine has been actually that there hasn't been the large cyber operations that people were expecting at the start of the conflict. And I think this quote from Jeremy Fleming, Sir Jeremy Fleming, who's the head of GCHQ, really pulls together many of the threads that I feel very strongly about. And really what he's saying is there has been this commentary that there hasn't been the Pearl Harbor nature of cyber attacks. But I think this totally misses the point, and that is the quote from Sir Jeremy Fleming. When people are looking for Pearl Harbor, it was never our understanding that you would have these types of catastrophic cyber attacks central to Russians' use of offensive cyber in their military doctrine. To think otherwise misjudges how cyber has an effect in military campaigns. I'll talk in a moment about the examples that we have seen of cyber operations that are being conducted in Ukraine. Microsoft has put out some really fabulous open source products on that. They've been one of the most active in terms of being in country in Ukraine, engaging, but also actively defending Ukrainian networks. And I think from an IHL perspective, that raises many interesting questions in terms of the role of the private sector getting engaged in those discussions. But also when you had President Zelensky calling for people to be attacking Russian infrastructure, and you have groups like Anonymous coming in and pledging support for the Ukrainian government, it also raises some really interesting questions around the application of IHL. So before we go into some of the examples of the way that cyber operations are being used in Ukraine, I wanted to touch on how we got to this point of having a very clear outcome in the negotiations that international humanitarian law applies. So I'll talk you through those agreements. So we had the reason that I'm framing this talk around the conflict in Ukraine is because it's the first very clear situation of armed conflict that we've had since this agreement was made in May 21. And my concern is that there's not enough attention being paid to it. And there is many opportunities for us to be calling out the behaviour that is potentially in violation of international humanitarian law, and that there isn't enough people calling that type of behaviour out. A lot of the focus is on kinetic violations of IHL. And if we aren't calling it out, then we are allowing this behaviour to become accepted behaviour. And I think it's really important, given that it's the first conflict where we've so directly seen the operations used during conflict. I'm also not so naive to think that, having agreed these rules in May, I want to put this on the table, that I would have expected that the conflict not to include a cyber dimension. If Russia is going to violate such a fundamental principle of international law as state sovereignty and roll its tanks across the border of a sovereign nation, I don't expect them, I expect them to, but it doesn't surprise me that they are also violating IHL in other international law in other contexts. And so with this group, and knowing of your interest, really the call to action for all of you is to say, we need to be calling out this behaviour, and there must be condemnation and consequences for any breaches of Russian cyber operations, just as we are condemning and calling out Russia's behaviour in a kinetic space. So to just put in context the UN discussions, this was a 3-year set of discussions. It was only ever meant to be 2 years, but COVID happened, as we all know. It was actually 2 sets of discussions that we had running at the same time. So we had a GGE, so a group of governmental experts who came together. This has been the format that the UN has discussed cyber issues in the context of international security since 1998. It's been through a series of small groups of governmental experts. Are people here aware of the GGE processes? Yeah, it's not nods. And what was new is that in 2019, we also had concurrently running the open-ended working group, which was a process that was open to all UN member states. So it was the first time the negotiations we went from a 25 group of experts in closed door negotiations to open floor of the General Assembly, everybody involved. The dynamics of those negotiations were very, very different. I was the Australian lead negotiator in both negotiations. In most circumstances, there were different negotiators in different groups. And just by virtue of having every country in the world engaged in the open-ended working group discussions, it was a very, very different discussion. But it also gave us the ability to actually provide leverage on international law issues that we weren't able to get in closed door negotiations, because it was harder for countries like Russia and China to totally dismiss the application of international law, or be as dismissive of it as they would be behind closed doors. And so that, in part, although the actual agreement of IHL came out of the GGE, it was, in my view, because of the pressure we were able to apply in the OEWG that then built for us to be able to negotiate the outcome in the GGE. Just a little bit of a recap in terms of where we were at. So in 2013, that was the seminal agreement in the 2013 GGE, which was chaired by Australia. So it's something that we should be proud of. Was the agreement that existing international law applies in cyberspace, and that's a blanket agreement. And then in 2015, they were able to negotiate some more detail and refer to the principles of proportionality, necessity, humanity, and distinction, but not use the words international humanitarian law. It was a red line. So, this is a symptom of all of these reports being negotiated documents, and the call that was made at the time was having reference to the principles was still a step forward, even if we didn't have the specific reference to IHL. So the significant thing in the 2021 GGE report is that we actually specifically have the words IHL included. And I'll talk you through the different positions and the reason the wording takes that very strange wording that it currently has. There are some people, though, that say, so it's not correct to say that countries only agreed that international humanitarian law applies to cyber operations, that agreement happened in 2021. Because actually that agreement happened in 2013 when we agreed that existing international law applies. What happened in 2021 is that we now have it written down on paper and it is putting it to bed unequivocally that it does apply. And so because there were countries like Russia and to a certain extent China who expressed strong reticence of having the express references to IHL. So let me talk about some of the specifics that were engaged, and all of these remarks that I'm going to be making are in reference to comments that were made in the open-ended working group negotiations. So these are all comments that were made publicly on the floor, hence why I'm able to speak so openly about them. But this picture is a picture of me, the person that I'm looking backwards, looking at and speaking is Wang Lei. He's the Chinese cyber ambassador. I had just delivered remarks talking about Australia's commitment to act in accordance with international humanitarian law, disclosing the fact that we have cyber operations, we use them, but we always use them in accordance with the norms that we have agreed within this wonderful building that we're all sitting here in at the United Nations, not right now, but that was the way that I was phrasing the words. And he took to the floor after me and responded very strongly, saying that it's irresponsible of countries to be talking about cyber operations. We shouldn't, by referencing international humanitarian law, you are encouraging the militarization of cyberspace, and we find this deeply irresponsible. And you can see what my reaction to that comment was, which was captured on camera. It's one of my favorite photos of the delegation. Sitting behind me is my legal advisor, Harry Aitken. He is one of the most brilliant lawyers that I have worked with. And just sitting around, I think also just the looks on people's faces and the guy in the background, like holding his head, it captures so much for me about what that negotiation actually was very much like. For the Russians part, this is Ambassador Krutsky. He's Putin's special advisor on information security in the context of international security. This was us in New York in March 2021. The UN building was actually still closed. And so a lot of the negotiations we were doing were in rented hotel rooms, and it was all very makeshift. This was in an Irish bar, and sitting above it, I don't know if you can actually read the top, but it's a sign that says "Be good or be gone." And this was the motto that we agreed we were going to have for the conclusion of the OEWG negotiations, and then carry into the GGE. The reason that I have the thing of cheese and what's meant to be vodka but actually looks like a sake container and the grapes there is because when the negotiations went, we were negotiating in person, and then we obviously had to move to virtual. Negotiating, can you imagine negotiating with 193 countries in a virtual format? You think WebEx is bad, WebEx with 193 countries, and trying to do textual negotiations. It was really quite a challenge. But it was also a challenge because obviously the small conversations you have in the margins are the conversations where you usually get those breakthroughs. And Russia, I had formed a relationship with Ambassador Krutsky such that we were having quite regular and very useful conversations. But when we went virtual, that was really difficult. And the way that I managed to convince him to come to a WebEx bilateral call with me was to send him a bottle of Russian vodka, a bottle of French wine, and say that we needed to talk about mixing French wine with French vodka, mixing French wine with Russian vodka, because there was a Russian and a French proposal on the table and we needed to talk about those particular things. And so I sent out a tasking cable through our diplomatic network asking the Russian embassy our embassy in Moscow to go and purchase this, and they had great fun trying to choose which bottle of wine and which bottle of vodka, but it had the effect of then bringing him back to have the bilateral conversations, and we had several conversations over the course of the virtual negotiations. And so it really required a level of creativity in those negotiations that certainly we hadn't had to resort to before. Russia's view on international humanitarian law was and this demonstrates the value of listening really closely to what your counterparts are saying in these types of negotiations. And you'll see when we get to the final agreement that we reached why that is. Russia had this strange preoccupation with saying IHL only applies during armed conflict. And I kept on saying, yeah, of course it does. Like, I don't understand why that's a big deal. It's a fact that it only applies during armed conflict. And actually, I know there are some very small nuances where people will argue that it doesn't, but like predominantly, it applies during armed conflict, right? And they were putting this forward as if we were trying to say that we wanted IHL to apply at all time during peacetime. And our response to that is, well, no, that's why we have the peacetime norms of responsible state behaviour that were agreed in 2015. That's why you have the existing framework of international law, the UN Charter, etc., which applies during outside of conflict. They also repeatedly made the point that it's not settled that cyber can be a weapon. And that we needed to have more study about cyber being used as a weapon. And this highlights another thing that was really useful through the open-ended working group discussions, which was Russia and China both repeatedly went on the record saying, we don't have offensive cyber operations. And we all know they do, right? And so when a country like China and Russia is sitting on the floor of the UN saying, we don't have these operations, it's irresponsible of Australia to be talking about it this way. And then I was able to work with our colleagues at HED, at ASD, at Defence, and make strong statements in response saying, well, yes, we do have these tools, but like any other means and method of warfare, we use them in accordance with international law, with our domestic obligations, with the norms of responsible state behaviour. And that impact that has on Russia and China's credibility in the broader negotiation is really significant. And so being able to be transparent about our capabilities, not disclosing things that are classified, and we never will, but being open about them is a really powerful strategic tool that we have. I've touched on this point already in terms of for China, that it was that they felt strongly that it was encouraging armed conflict. The ICRC was brilliant throughout these negotiations, and they put multiple very sensible proposals forward on the table and just were saying, you know, this is what you're putting forward defies common sense. The existence of international humanitarian law does not encourage conflict in any other domain. Why would it in cyberspace? And having statements like that coming from the ICRC at pivotal points in the negotiations was really important. We also there were multiple people who, including myself, who tried to make wonderful analogies about why IHL was not going to encourage the militarization of cyberspace. But the best one was put forward by the Norwegian delegation, who said that saying that recognizing IHL's application to cyber operations is encouraging conflict would be like saying having speeding signs encourages speeding. And it was, just getting that, because we were also in a room full of, so you have 193 delegates in the room, but they're not lawyers. Most of them, this is one issue of, 20 that they're negotiating at the same time. You've got small missions. And so you actually do need something that just very clearly cuts through and makes sense without going into intricate legal responses, which of course we did as well. But that was the most powerful. I'll just touch very briefly on the OEWG outcome, because it is significant. Really what the OEWG outcome achieved was that we solidified everything that had previously come before in all of the GGE processes. That sounds like nothing, but actually, if you think about opening a negotiation up from 25 countries to 193, and we did not move backwards on anything, that is really significant. It was an enormous diplomatic effort. And the concern was, when the OEWG was first established, was that Russia wanted to rewrite everything that we had previously agreed. And so to get to the end of the OEWG and to have retained all of these basic base level agreement, international law applies, the norms of responsible state behaviour, really is a very significant achievement. We can now, I know there's a lot of work to be done in terms of the depth to come from this, but there is no country in the world that can now say that cyberspace is the Wild West. Every country has negotiated and has agreed that international law applies. IHL was referenced, but it was only referenced in the chair's summary. And that was a decision that the chair, Ambassador Lauber, who's pictured here, he's just gaveling the report. It was quite an emotional moment for all of us. He made the decision to take it out because he felt that it would be the thing that would prevent consensus. And he thought preserving, getting agreement on all of the other things was the most important issue. For the GGE, this is Ambassador Patriota also gaveling the GGE agreement. You'll see here many of these elements that I was talking to before. So this shows how the why statements are the way that they are. So we ended up by saying that international law only applies in situations of armed conflict. Who's that for? The Russians. We recall the established principles of necessity, distinction, blah, blah, blah. And then we recognize the need for further study. That was for the Russians. And that we underscored that by recalling these principles by no means legitimizes or encourages conflict, which was for the Chinese. But we have now, again, an equivocal statement here that international humanitarian law applies to cyber operations, particularly when you read it. This is a sub-paragraph when you read it in line with the full paragraph that sits over the top. This was something that no one thought we would be able to get out of this GGE, including we went into the final negotiation. It was myself, the US head of delegation, the Russian head of delegation, and the Chinese head of delegation. And even as we went into that negotiation, it was very unclear as to whether or not we would get this. My objective, and we were holding the pen, was that we would, if at all possible, we weren't going to compromise the rest of the GGE report, but if we could. And of course, getting this was tied up very much in other outcomes that were in the report around other issues. So, you achieve this because of other things. wanted to acknowledge the Australian delegation here. So we have Tess Cluckow from AGD, Harry, who I mentioned earlier, and Bryony Daly-Whitworth, who's now taken on the lead negotiation role. And not pictured here is the ASD and the defence lawyers, who were also really pivotal and this was being negotiated in the middle of the night in Australia, and everyone was online. I was in New York for the final negotiations, but everyone else was online, very active. And that being able to think on your feet and come up with creative legal responses at 2 o'clock in the morning is a real challenge. So just touching briefly now on these are 2 slides that come out of the Microsoft report, which I've credited here. And it really does, this is the precursor to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it really shows and links how at every time there was a significant political development, there was also a significant cyber development happening simultaneous. And I really don't think people have appreciated the amount of activity that has gone on in parallel, and it emphasizes the hybrid nature of the conflict. The next slide is looking at major key developments from a kinetic perspective, and then mapping them against, so that the kinetic is on the top, and then at the bottom is cyber operations that were going along. I'll share these slides so that you can actually look at them, but I would encourage, especially as I think you can't actually see it sitting above there. Yeah. The point of this is I would actually encourage everyone to look at the Microsoft report. There isn't yet any open source material from a government apart from that statement from Sir Jeremy Fleming. But this it really does help to identify that pattern, that it really is for every movement that there is in the kinetic space, that there is a corresponding cyber operation. Although Microsoft did also make the point that it's not possible to identify whether it's kinetic operations happening at the same time with the same objective, or whether it's actually coordinated. And so, there's some interesting research to follow from that. So where to next? So I'm conscious of wanting to leave lots of time for questions. In terms of where to next in the UN context, the UN negotiations are continuing. The Russians established a 5-year open-ended working group, which continues. My personal view is, at the moment, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because of the increased polarization, the strengthening of allies and alliances, that moving this forward within the UN will be very, very difficult in the short term, at least. So I think the 2 things that I would really encourage, and this goes back to the points that I made at the start, is that we really need to be looking, and I would encourage all of you to be actively looking. We need people to be writing and to be examining. I haven't actually looked and assessed whether the operations referred to in the Microsoft report would classify as a violation of international humanitarian law. I think, but we need people to be looking at these things, and if it is, we need to be calling it out, because the standard that we walk past is the standard that we accept. And so for anyone looking for interesting areas of research or topical areas of research, this is one that I would highly, highly recommend, and there will be a lot of interest in it if you are doing that. The second thing I would say is that we really need to set the standard ourselves. And this goes back to the point that I was saying about the power of being able to sit in the room on the floor of the UN and say, yes, we have offensive cyber operations, and yes, we use them in accordance with international humanitarian law. And our concern is the countries that we know have these weapons, but will not acknowledge that they have those weapons, and therefore don't acknowledge the constraints that exist on their use. That is so incredibly powerful to be able to do that. The point that I'm making here is that there is often a hesitancy to say more and be more specific in our views on how international humanitarian law applies to cyber operations. Often that is because there is a sense that if we are more specific about our understandings of how international humanitarian law applies, it will constrain our own operations. And I think we need to really push back on that. I pushed back on that quite strongly when I was within government. So I was talking to Rain before. This is not something that I'm suddenly saying new out because I'm outside of government. It is what stands us apart is the fact that we will conduct operations, but we conduct them in accordance with international humanitarian law. If you look at the commentary that is going on at the moment in relation to the invasion of Ukraine and the divisions, and this has brought us together stronger than ever as allies and partners. We understand we're standing together to stand for freedom and democracy. You're hearing a lot of this type of language. We need to defend this rules-based international order. We don't want to rewrite the rules-based international order. The reason that we are now suddenly defending it is because we're at risk of losing it. And what makes a difference is being able to point to, well, why should countries be listening to us when we're talking about defending the rules-based international order? Yes, we have stronger alliances with countries in Europe. Yes, we have strong alliances with countries in the US. But there are a lot of countries in the middle who really don't want to have to pick sides. And there are a lot of countries in the middle who look at us and call hypocrisy often. And being able to point to things like this and articulate how international humanitarian law applies is a really important distinguisher between Australian cyber operations and Russian cyber operations or any other country's cyber operations. And in my view, if we are conducting operations that aren't complying with international humanitarian law, and I genuinely believe Australia doesn't. We always, we have a very rigorous review process. But if that is the concern, then we shouldn't be conducting those types of operations. What is it that we are fighting for is what I would suggest if we're not fighting in accordance with international humanitarian law. And so, we are able to articulate how international humanitarian law applies in other areas and not to be so constrained. I think that same principle should be applying to cyber operations as well. And I would be very interested. I know you've got some government colleagues speaking or on a panel later, and I know that they have different views probably. That's all.
Excellent. Thank you very much.